I have with me today's Bobby Harrington. He's the founder of discipleship.org, local pastor, author of many, many resources. Bobby, I'm just glad to have you here. I feel indebted to you. I spent a lot of time on your site and listening to what you and the growing discipleship.org tribe is saying about disciple making. Thank you for leading the way.
David, it's my privilege to be with you, and I have so much respect for you and what you've done over the years. So it'll be a great time.
Yeah, well,
You go ahead. I think you've got some questions for me.
yeah, I really do. And so we want to jump in. A thing we want to talk about is one aspect of the national study that discipleship.org did a couple of years ago. Of course, we all know that less than five, out of that study, the big finding, less than 5% of churches have a disciple-making culture. Just quickly, how that's impacted me in our ministry is we just want to change that number. That's what we're after. But today, specifically for this session, we want to talk about the often overlooked importance of language. So just tell us a little bit about what you guys found in the study related to the language we use when it comes to discipleship.
Let me just say a word up front. You may have already said this if you have, forgive me, but language literally creates worlds. Language describes things. Language brings clarity. A friend of mine brought up yesterday that clarity beats charisma every day. And so clarity on exactly what we're talking about, what it looks like, is super important. For example, in a given church, if I were to say, how would you define a disciple? In a given church, if there's 100 people there, you're probably going to get 100 different definitions of a disciple. And if that's true, then you've got 100 different aspirations of what we're trying to be. And we've got to be very, very clear. And so we got to be super clear on defining the world, defining what we want, being really clear, because the clearer we are about what it is, and the more we hold one another to being or building what it is, the more effective we will be.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I think the first term I really ever defined was what is a disciple in terms of a concept coming out of the Great Commission that just has sort of been my way of defining it. And so I think I just accidentally stumbled into that, but I think over the years it's changed my life. The way we often refer, you've said a lot and talked a lot about clarity and words. We would say clarity isn't everything, but it changes everything. And that's what I hear you saying, that when we have clear words. Now, the study indicated that that wasn't the case.
Yeah, that's correct. Let's take the word discipleship. The word discipleship, people may be surprised here, is actually not in the Bible. The word discipleship literally just means the state of being a disciple. So when you ask people, as people often do, how's discipleship going? And there's not a standard or clear definition. People just put whatever meaning they want to in that. And one of the things the study came out is that there's a sense in which everything is discipleship. And when everything's discipleship, whatever that is, we define it. When everything's discipleship, then ultimately and unfortunately, almost nothing is discipleship. So, and here's what we mean by that. Some people would say, our church does a great job with praise and worship. That's discipleship. Our church does a great job with feeding the poor. That's discipleship. Our church does a great job with Bible education. That's discipleship. Robert Coleman told me a few years ago that he was a part of a denomination and they had a discipleship department. It's a big denomination. And he said, but they ended up making it anything and everything. And again, it was nothing. So even though I lead, quote, discipleship.org, I prefer the term disciple making because we can pull that back more close to Jesus. and define disciple making by looking at what Jesus did. The point is that when it comes to discipleship, it's a real problem with, what does that word mean? And when we understand what it means, what does it apply to exactly?
Yeah, well, we appreciate the work you guys have done in putting together some definitions and, a good starting point, if not ending point. And so, hey, there's 4 or 5 key definitions that you say every church needs to land on. What would they be? What are the words that you would lift up, and a little bit about those definitions? Help us a little bit here.
Okay. So one of the recommendations at the end of the study is that we actually champion clear definitions. So what we have tried to do, David, at discipleship.org and also renew.org, I have the privilege of being the point leader for both organizations, is actually champion these definitions of these keywords. I'm going to start with disciple, then I'm going to talk about disciple making, disciple maker, and disciple making culture. I'll give you those. I actually have a list. If you're watching this, I want to encourage you to go to discipleship.org, go to the About tab, and you'll find the definitions there. So the first one I want to explain is the word disciple. So Jim Putman has a really clear, winsome, helpful definition that we came across years ago, and we just encouraged everybody at discipleship.org to champion this language. And it's based on Matthew 4:19, where Jesus invited the disciples to be disciples. He said, "Come, follow me, and I will make you into fishers of men." You have the same thing in Mark chapter 1, verse 17, I believe it is. So if you look at that and you say, could that be a good place to have a good verse to have a definition? Now, David, let me be clear about this. The New Testament does not give you a definition. The word disciple literally is learner. So what does that mean? Or apprentice. So you want to look at Jesus and look at the Great Commission and look at the New Testament and say, can we sum that up in a succinct definition based on one verse? And the answer is yes. Matthew 4:19. So a disciple is someone who's following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and is committed to the mission of Jesus. Someone who's following Jesus is being changed by Jesus and is committed to the mission of Jesus. If I can, let me explain that last part. One of the things that happens when discipleship is basically framed as spiritual formation is you don't have that third part, that people want to become a lot like Jesus. In fact, the goal to become more and more like Christ. Just want to be like Jesus, which is ultimately, once we've been saved, that's our goal, to become more and more like Jesus. But David, let me be transparent with you. A lot of people have a vision of becoming a lot like Jesus or more like Jesus, or without actually doing what Jesus did when he devoted, 65 to 70% of his time in his public ministry to making disciples. So we argue you can't really totally be like Jesus, who made disciples and emphasized making disciples, unless you too make disciples. So again, that's our first definition: following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and committed to the mission of Jesus.
Let me just say I really appreciate that, and I think there's a really key clarification that you brought. And we confuse spiritual formation, as you said, with what Christ is actually calling us to do, to be disciple makers. This is a tension that I've had, so I just really appreciate you bringing clarity to it.
Well, I don't want to miss something that's often missed. Too often, and use discipleship rather than disciple making, discipleship becomes a cul-de-sac. You get people in these discipling relationships and they don't multiply. It's like you have a great experience, but you don't go and reach lost people, or it becomes so inwardly focused. So having a really clear definition helps that. So that's number one. Now, that leads to the definition of a disciple maker. So when we use the word disciple making, we can go back to the language of the New Testament, where Jesus told us to make disciples. So when Jesus told us to make disciples, he gives that commandment to his disciples out of a context where he had discipled them. So we want to go back and say, how did Jesus make disciples? And that's going to become our model as best we can for making disciples. So here's what disciple making is. There's going to be two key words I want to highlight. It's going to be relational and it's going to be intentional. In fact, if I were to sum up Jesus' method, let me give you another definition here that you didn't ask for, but what is Jesus' disciple-making method? Intentional, relational, disciple-making. Robert Coleman mapped this out years ago in his book, The Master Plan of Evangelism. When you look at Jesus' method, what is it? He's highly intentional. When he invites, even in John chapter 1, when he invites Andrew and the other disciple to come into his life, he's got a master plan from beginning to end, and it's intentional. He's highly intentional. He's highly relational. And then he disciples them to follow him and become like him. So Jesus' method, intentional, relational, disciple making. What is disciple making? Here's a definition. And again, this is in our report. Disciple making is entering into relationships to intentionally help people follow Jesus, be changed by Jesus, and join the mission of Jesus.
Yeah. Very good. I love that. Same definition as disciple, but different position, different relationship. Now I'm leading. I'm becoming a disciple maker. And what I found, Bobby, is that this is the thing that changes everything. When we start producing disciple makers. I love that.
What's a disciple maker? A disciple maker is a disciple of Jesus who enters into relationships with people to intentionally help them follow Jesus, be changed by Jesus, and join the mission of Jesus.
Yeah, very good. I love that.
Let me give you the definition of a disciple-making culture. A disciple-making culture, the beliefs, habits, and narrative. Those are the three parts of culture, by the way. Beliefs or values, habits, and then narrative. The beliefs, habits, and narrative of a church, constantly repeated with congruence and intentionality, that make it clear to almost everyone all the time, including newcomers, that disciple making is what everybody does in this church.
Yeah, I love that. It brings it all together. Hey, in wrapping up here, you're a pastor. What is the greatest tension, or one of the greatest tensions, real quickly, when you begin to move from program-based ministry or a program-based engine to a disciple-making engine? What are these churches going to face?
So the biggest thing I would say to begin with is you've got to realize you're wanting to create a culture that is different than the culture that the people who are coming to your church have. Even if they're not church people, in North America, there are some presuppositions, even by atheists, about church, like Sunday morning, you're going to have a mass or whatever, you're going to have church services. So the number one thing you've got to do is get all of your leaders on board. And then when you get your leaders on board, you got to constantly, always, all the time, be doing things to create culture so that people realize that the culture of this church is very different than other churches. And you can never let up. You got to talk about it all the time. You got to insist on practices that uphold that. And then you have to keep explaining the values. So I'd say lead your leaders, get them on board, and then work on the people all the time, that this church is all about being disciples and making disciples.
Yeah, it's a journey and it never ends.
That's right.
Bobby, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll look forward to continuing this conversation along the way.
David, it's been my pleasure. God bless you.